It's finally time to talk about Avengers Endgame. We left off on a less than flattering cliffhanger for this film, so you may be wondering, how could this villain be so bad when he was so highly praised in Infinity War? Well, there's a lot of reasons. So let's get into it. The captivating and well-written Thanos that we grew to love in Infinity War gets killed off in Endgame's opening scene. Then he gets replaced by this alternate Thanos, who is underdeveloped, less dynamic, and more cliché.
You have my respect, Stark. When I'm done, half of humanity will still be alive. I hope they remember you. What I'm about to do to your stubborn, annoying little planet. I'm gonna enjoy it very, very much.
He will go on to accomplish far less, and will forever live in the shadow of his former self. Why the Russos decided to do this is beyond me. They had a great villain perfectly built up, and then just stripped him of everything that made him entertaining. You could say they might have wrote themselves into a corner with how they ended Infinity War, given that beating Thanos at this point would be a near impossible task. Except, a similar situation happens in the comics, but they resolve it in a much more satisfying way. Once comic Thanos kills off half the universe, he just keeps on winning, killing more and more powerful beings and growing in power until he feels that he no longer needs his mortal body, so he abandons it. Then in doing this, his hubris gets the better of him and he briefly leaves the Infinity Gauntlet vulnerable. Then of all people, a tortured and near-death Nebula is able to take advantage of the situation and claims the gauntlet for herself, undoing all the damage that Thanos caused and stripping him of his newly gained power in the process, and thus making Nebula the new big bad that needed to be stopped. All this to say that killing the first Thanos was a needless and poor decision, one that not only hurts Thanos as a character, but one that also robbed Nebula of her biggest moment. Not only is new Thanos less interesting than former Thanos, but the Avengers are also unable to get justice for all the pain he caused them. The Russos have provided us memes at the expense of a good story. Having characters like Star-Lord, Iron Man, and Scarlet Witch get a second chance to redeem themselves against Thanos would have been very exciting and satisfying. There were many great rivalries that got built up in Infinity War that will just never go anywhere. Drax dedicated his entire life to killing Thanos, and he was barely even around when it finally happened. No, instead of all that, we get a CGI game of cosmic keep-away, in which we just kill time watching our heroes fight villains that they have already beaten in far more exciting ways during the last film. The Black Order especially gets reduced from being formidable mini-bosses to just being extra fluff that fills up the screen so that our heroes can have something to occupy their attention. Ant-Man literally just crushes one under his boot while on his way to do something more important. And this entire army has just become one big gray mess. What happened? Everything was going so well in Infinity War. Thanos 1 was brimming with life and color, but now all of a sudden they're doing their best to make Thanos 2 as dull and absent as possible. The Black Order was always dark and gray, as their name would suggest, but they worked in Infinity War because they were surrounded by bright and colorful locations that made them pop by contrast. But in Endgame, everything is as gray and muted as they are, so you can barely tell when one of them is on screen. The dull color palette of this final battle accurately reflects how unthreatening and predictable this conflict turned out to be. You might argue that making Thanos and his army look so dark and colorless was a necessary decision for environmental storytelling in order to make this final battle seem more bleak and helpless, and plenty of other films use the same method of adding drama to great success. That would be a valid point, if only this villainous force had any substance behind it whatsoever. The heroes have organized the most powerful force we've ever seen them in up to this point. On the other hand, we have the gray and lifeless Thanos 2 substituting for the better Thanos 1, then there's the Black Order, who we've already beaten in far more entertaining circumstances, and everyone else here is just a gray blob whose only purpose in life is to get punched, so there's no tension or drama in sight. On paper, this should be a squash in favor of the heroes, and the fact that it isn't just makes this fight feel like a waste of time. It's like the Russos couldn't decide if they wanted to make this scene pure heroic fan service or an epic, tension-filled final battle, so they ended up creating this awkward middle ground, with elements from both options that don't mix together all that well. After Endgame, we have technically one more Phase 3 film in the form of Spider-Man Far From Home, which barely counts as a Spider-Man film. The big bad here is Mysterio, and his presence actually brings up an important discussion as far as casting for adaptations go. Jake Gyllenhaal was the one they picked for the job, but as far as the comics go, this is terrible casting because Mysterio is canonically ugly. Early on, he was an aspiring actor, but his hideous looks kept him from the spotlight, so he hid under his fishbowl and turned to a life of crime, using Hollywood special effects to make himself seem heroic, while framing Spider-Man for his misdeeds. The film takes great inspiration from the comic, but it also takes great liberties at the same time, and with mixed results. On one hand, it's neat that they attempted to tie this film in with the other ones by making Mysterio and his allies former associates of Tony Stark. On the other hand, these Tom Holland films consistently suffer from having way too much Iron Man in them, and would benefit from standing on their own a bit more. With all that in mind, Mysterio was used pretty decently, having a great design and getting a lot of creativity with how they display his powers. The people who choreograph Loki's fights should take notes from this, because yes, Loki should be able to do a lot of similar things here, and much more. That's why it's so annoying when they just use knife. One last nitpick is that they still do the annoying CGI helmet removal that gets way overused and takes you out of the movie by reminding you that these costumes are all CGI. Granted, it makes sense that Mysterio could do this with his holographic abilities, however, it would be traditionally very out of character for Mysterio to reveal his face this much. You know, considering, especially while he's playing his hero facade, and in spite of all the changes that the film made to his character, it could still benefit from hiding Quentin Beck a bit more, and leaving him to be a bit more mysterious, especially considering the fact that he's trying to claim that he's not from this earth. But ultimately, it's probably for the best that they didn't make him ugly, because this film has more than enough lazy, migraine-inducing, cheap humor in it, so I have no doubt that the writers wouldn't be able to help themselves and would relentlessly attack this low-hanging fruit. Mysterio allegedly dies at the end of this film, but they could easily bring him back due to his deceptive nature, should they ever decide to finally commit to a Sinister Six film. Now with all that behind us, we move on to Phase 4. And it's no secret that all these films and shows are filled to the brim with problems, so it would be a bit redundant to only speak on the villains here. So we're just going to speedrun right through this section, then circle back with a conclusion on why it's so important to focus on this villain problem, and look for some possible solutions. So here we go, Phase 4. WandaVision is up first, and no, the villain is not Agatha all along, nor was it this heroic toxic male that tried to save this brainwashed town by using guns. It also wasn't this ambiguously absent White Vision either. The real villain here is Wanda herself, the woman who held an entire town hostage and forced them to act out her fantasy against their will, and while having them all fully conscious the entire time.
Fine, when you let us sleep, we have your nightmares.
However, the show doesn't quite see Wanda as the antagonist here, and for some reason tries to vilify anyone that tries to stop her evil deeds. It's one thing to turn your hero to the dark side, but that's not what we got. Instead, we're told that it's understandable to behave like a batshit crazy person, as long as you've had enough trauma.
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
No, you sacrificed nothing and ruined these people's lives so you could selfishly play pretend like a child. You are evil. Later down the road, Multiverse of Madness attempts to course correct Wanda, so we'll come back to her in a sec. Falcon and the Winter Soldier. This one has the iconic supervillain Carly. Isn't that fun? She's a terrorist that does evil things, then gets a free pass because Falcon pities her. Meanwhile, the US agent is frowned upon because he kills the terrorists that he was tasked to eliminate. But it was a bad thing because he did it while he was angry, I guess. It's a little bit bass-backwards. Anyway, on to Loki, where Loki is back to his old evil self, but then he's not again 2 seconds later. We also get the debut of Kang here in a rather unrecognizable form. He's a bit softer and more pathetic when compared to the Great Conqueror that we're used to. However, I don't quite want to hate on this guy just yet, simply for being different. Reason being that Kang here is a character with many different forms, so it could be cool to see several lesser Kangs show up early on as main villains in various films and shows to steadily hype up the debut of the one true all-powerful Thanos-level Kang. It would be a unique and creative way to tie these various films together, while also giving your major villain an active role throughout. And by doing this, the writers would be able to take liberties with these alternate versions of Kang that would make them stand out from each other despite them technically being the same person. Personally, I'm not a big fan of multiverses and time travel as plot devices, but if you're going to use them, this could be a good way to make it interesting. And this did seem to be what the goal was, given what we saw here with Loki and also in Quantumania. Although this concept may not end up reaching its full potential at this point, given that Jonathan Majors seems to be getting cancelled now. So Kang's fate is up in the air at this point, and we'll just have to wait and see how things play out for now. On to Black Widow, with this old, chubby idiot that nobody remembers. And also Taskmaster, a cult favorite from the comics. Taskmaster is a powerful mercenary that can mimic any fighting style that he encounters. In the movie, he kinda does that, only his power is not nearly as effective or utilized as creatively as it could be. His costume is made to be way less fun, and oh yeah, they photoshopped a woman's head on his body for some reason, and gave him this super shallow sympathetic edge that makes him barely a good guy, while also being completely void of any personality. Next up is Shang-Chi, but we already touched on this a bit in an earlier video. So in short, the Mandarin should be one of the all-time greatest villains put to the big screen, but this dude is not that guy. Instead, he's more so just an evil version of Shang-Chi. Granted, he has a little bit more depth than most villains nowadays, but that's not saying much. Moving on to the Eternals. This one has an evil Superman, because that's never been done before. Hawkeye. They brought back the once great Kingpin from the Daredevil series, just so they could immediately drag him down to the level of all the other terrible villains in this franchise. There's also some other bad guys, but whatever. Now we're on to Spider-Man No Way Home, and I'll actually slow down a bit here, because this one is worth talking about, as they brought back several villains from older films. First off, Sandman and the Lizard were very clearly tacked onto this film last minute, and their roles are so out of place and awkward that it probably would have been better if they weren't even there at all, because all they do while they're on screen is take you out of the movie and remind you that the original actors didn't return, and so the filmmakers try to hide that fact with out-of-place CGI and dumb character decisions. That said, Electro, Green Goblin, and Doc Ock are also in this film and are utilized far better. Electro was not great in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but this film realizes that and puts a lot of work into improving Electro and making him far more interesting. Meanwhile, Doc Ock and especially the Green Goblin are not only just as good as they used to be, but they're arguably better than when we last saw them. You know, as long as you overlook all the plot holes and bad humor they come with, of course.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Ha!
Willem Dafoe kills it, metaphorically and literally in this role as Norman Osborn, as he easily bounces between being sympathetic, evil, and downright terrifying. My only criticism is that I wish they gave him his iconic mask and purple hood. Regardless, the Green Goblin is meant to be one of Spider-Man's ultimate rivals, and in this film he is portrayed as exactly that. And it should also be pointed out that this villain isn't all that powerful, meaning you don't need a world-conquering, multiverse-shattering threat in order to make your antagonist compelling. All you need to do is have them threaten what the hero wants to protect. This point will be relevant later on. One concerning aspect about the villains in this film is that they may cripple the longevity of this franchise long term, since they are all major Spider-Man villains, but they all come from separate universes and won't be returning. That means that if they ever want to, say, properly introduce an MCU Green Goblin, then Peter will already have prior knowledge as to who Norman Osborn is, and it'll be difficult to organically introduce either of the Osborns without cluing Peter in on where their stories will eventually end up. They also established that Oscorp doesn't exist in this universe, so he'll for sure have to be changed to some degree, and these potential new characters will have to compete with and try to top their alternate universe selves, who for the most part already set a pretty high bar. Conversely, this may push Sony to avoid reusing characters like Doc Ock and Green Goblin in favor of establishing characters that aren't tainted yet, which would still be a great shame because an MCU without Green Goblin or Doc Ock is missing out. Time will tell if this will become a problem or not, but this is another good reason as to why you should avoid using multiverses like this. It's fun in the moment, but it will break apart your world building long term. Next up is Moon Knight. This villain walks on glass, so that's pretty wizard, I suppose. Multiverse of Madness is up next with the return of Scarlet Witch, who is now in full-on mega-villain mode, foregoing all logic and reason in favor of relentlessly killing her way through the multiverse to regain her children who she only spent a week with, and who were never real in the first place. She had some neato spooky moments here and there, but any positives you could say about her were deeply undercut by how random and silly her decision-making was. Like, lady, if you really want to have kids, you could just go on a date and spare us all the trouble. It's all just bizarre and nonsensical here. My only hope here is that they don't try to make her sympathetic and easily forgiven if they ever decide to bring her back. She did a lot of messed up stuff that can't just get swept under the rug. Oh yeah, Shuma Gorath was there too, the dimension-conquering eyeball that most of you probably only know from Marvel vs. Capcom. Except, Marvel is not great at securing their properties, so he's actually Gargantos now. Not that his name matters, because he's only here to act like a mindless beast, with no personality, that is far weaker than his comic self, and gets killed off after one sloppily choreographed fight. The only benefit he provides to this film is to make super nerds go, "That guy looks like that other guy. Easter egg." Also in this film is a literal evil mirror of Doctor Strange. He was super necessary and added a lot to the film, with how he used music powers and died immediately. It's not like the writers couldn't just make creative parallels between Strange and Wanda, because subtlety is for chumps, you see, and apparently Caecilius wasn't enough of a mirror, nor was Baron Mordo, so they needed to make things a little more obvious for their dumb monkey brain audience. After Mom, we got Miss Marvel, Thor Love and Thunder, and She-Hulk, all of which share the same villain, that being Kevin, for allowing any of these projects to get made in the first place. Now, to be fair, many people cite Gore the God Butcher as one of the few redeeming qualities to Thor 4, but to be honest, that's about as flattering as saying the corn was the prettiest part of the shit I took last night. We're just gonna skip over I Am Groot and Werewolf by Night, which speeds us along to Wakanda Forever, with the iconic, probably now cancelled, Namor. Namor is a bargain bin replacement for the far more interesting Namor. This goes up there with the Mandarin and Baron Zemo as one of the worst comic-to-film adaptations within the MCU. This guy went from bullying Magneto to having the same weakness as Super Friends Aquaman. Failure. On to Ant-Man Quantumania, with a cameo from the Wasp. Many complaints towards this film were about how the new Thanos got taken out by literal ants. That complaint is valid, however the MCU creatives could salvage this by doing what we talked about earlier, and establishing that this is just a lesser version of Kang, with a proper, much more powerful version still out there. The Harry Potter series already expertly accomplished something very similar with how they hyped up Voldemort, by making weaker versions of himself battle Harry Potter in the forms of Professor Quirrell, Tom Riddle, and so on. Voldemort starts out the series in a weakened state, so that a young, inexperienced Harry Potter can stand a chance against him. Then they both steadily grow in strength over the years, until Voldemort was finally able to regain full power, and Harry matured enough to stand a real chance against him. If the MCU wanted to do something similar, they could have these lesser Kangs show up to fight other lesser heroes like Ant-Man, so that our heroes can catch on to this looming threat, and have a chance to prepare for it so that when the real deal comes around, they'll be strong enough to face him. This could be the groundwork for an exciting story if they play it out right. Although the MCU's ability to produce anything competent these days has fallen far from what it used to be. Either way, the potential is still there. MODOK also made his debut in this film, and he has become the living embodiment of rock bottom. Now, to be fair, MODOK as a concept is silly and rightfully warrants being made fun of to some degree, given that he is basically just a giant head on a chair. However, he is still supposed to be incredibly dangerous and horrifying. There are supposed to be layers to this creature. Instead, they did the bare minimum to make him an easy and often literal punching bag. It's just a waste of a once creative and bizarre villain. If you want to use your villains to make jokes, then use the Wall, or Stiltman, or any of the other dozens of terrible villains who have come and gone in the comics. Heck, you could even just make one up if you have to. Please just don't waste great villains who have far more to offer than your terrible attempts at comedy. Last up, as of the day I'm making this video, is Guardians of the Galaxy 3, with the latest villain being the High Evolutionary. This guy was pretty decent. They gave him a well-established and memorable personality. Still, his design pales in comparison to his comic self, and he feels like he doesn't really accomplish all that much for what was supposed to be the final villain for this group of Guardians. Regardless, he was still more entertaining than most other entries on this list. Now, I apologize for rushing to the end here, but I really want to get to the point of why we're discussing all of this in the first place. Why bring up problems from films that came out over a decade ago, and why focus specifically on the bad guys? Well, to state the obvious, villains are important. In fact, they are essential. For the majority of superhero stories, the villain is the second most important character, just behind the hero himself. You can make your heroes as well written as possible, but without a good villain to balance them out, they themselves will naturally become less captivating and enjoyable. The Avengers and the MCU as a whole exploded into the mainstream because it introduced moviegoers to a whole new world of fun, exciting, and interconnected heroes who each have their own unique stories, powers, and big personalities. There's a great appeal in watching how these different characters combine or clash when mixed together, and it's no wonder why Marvel became such a powerhouse of a brand, having built up decades of great heroes and stories to pull from prior to filmmaking. However, this MCU journey can only be so exciting for as long as these characters face compelling enough adversity, and Marvel ran into trouble very quickly when people started to notice that they didn't. Let's do a quick recap. Iron Man was an amazing film. Iron Man 2 was significantly more mid, because it retreads a lot of the same ground from the first film. The Incredible Hulk had a dud of a finale, because his villain was messy and only offered noise over substance. Thor was a rather uninspired film, and its main benefit was just setting up things to come, some of which never did. The first Avenger was slightly better, but also created a lot of good setups with lackluster payoffs. The Avengers itself was great, but its main villain was cursed to never utilize his full potential. Iron Man 3 was a complete waste of a film, because the director wanted to make punchlines instead of great villains. Thor 2 was a snooze fest of a film, because it offered the most basic, stock, forgettable villains imaginable. The Winter Soldier was another great entry, with an excellent main villain. However, its side villains were severely lacking. Guardians 1 had a set of basic villains, but was balanced out by the introduction of its exciting new heroes and a Nebula. Age of Ultron became the worst Avengers film by a wide margin, because they did just about everything wrong with handling an otherwise iconic villain who could have offered so much more. Ant-Man was an okay film, but was prevented from being great due to yet another waste of a villain. Civil War was great because it was primarily heroes fighting heroes, but when the villain was on screen, he single-handedly dragged down the film's quality, and produced its most forgettable moments despite having the potential to be its breakout star. Doctor Strange was a basic film overall, with the promise of a greater villain that is yet to be carried out. Guardians 2 offered a decent villain, but ultimately another one that didn't quite reach his full potential. Homecoming offered a great villain that carried this film, along with terrible side villains that tried to drag it down. Thor Ragnarok was similar to Homecoming in that regard, as well as reminding us of great villains who would never show up. Black Panther presented a villain whose greatness was widely debated, while also offering us one of the worst final battles in the franchise. Infinity War was excellent, nearly perfect in some aspects. However, its quality suffers thanks to its far inferior sequel that it is directly tied to. Ant-Man and the Wasp as a whole was a largely forgettable film, and its villains were a major contribution as to why. Captain Marvel presents a villain that was physically incapable of hurting its hero, so try to make heads or tails of that. Endgame was spoon-fed everything it needed to be one of the greatest films imaginable, having one of the best villains in the franchise, but in a bizarre maneuver, it threw all of its greatness in the trash in favor of being significantly less compelling and enjoyable. Far From Home was a cringe-heavy film whose villain was okay at best, but one who couldn't quite carry the movie as effectively as Vulture did in the previous outing. Then from there, we have the horrific mess that turned out to be Phase 4. To say the villains in most of these projects were bad is an understatement. understatement. And so far, Kang's attempts to recreate the hype that Thanos left behind have been about as successful as the Shockmaster's debut. So what should they have done differently? For starters, let's examine what makes a good villain. Thematically speaking, a good villain will stand for the opposite values that the hero stands for. Scar uses deception against his family to gain power and rules with fear, while Simba challenges him in order to rule with loyalty and respect. Killmonger similarly parallels the Black Panther as an evil copy, but he comes up short because his worst deeds either don't happen, get undone, or don't affect the heroes at all. Instead of leaving the legacy of being a great villain, his legacy is merely a debate as to whether his actions are justified or not, and they aren't, just to be clear. A villain may parallel the hero by walking a similar path, but never growing or learning from their mistakes. Chick Hicks shows us everything that Lightning McQueen would have been had he never matured during his time in Radiator Springs. Yellow Jacket attempts to parallel Ant-Man, but instead of representing what Scott could be if he were on the wrong path, he just takes what makes Ant-Man special and removes it by having the same power, and just giving us a shallow final battle. Then as MODOK, he does nothing to affect the heroes in any way, being even more useless than Jar Jar Binks. The villain could represent a goal that the hero aspires to reach. Rattlesnake Jake was the true legend that Rango was pretending to be, and as such, Jake exposed Rango for his phony act. However, Rango defeated this villain by earning his respect, and proving himself to be a legend in his own right. Now don't let the irony get lost on you, and that all these examples I am using are being pulled from children's movies. This villain problem isn't an issue of Disney watering everything down to be family friendly. Not that Marvel has always been all that family friendly to begin with, but had that been the case, it still wouldn't be a valid excuse. In fact, many of cinema's greatest villains come from classic Disney cartoons. But even if you strip all that fancy thematic stuff away and make your villain as simple as possible, the potential is still there to make them great. You don't need gore, bad language, depravity, great power, or even great depth in order to make a good villain. At their core, all you truly need is for them to make the hero's journey as difficult as it could possibly be. Any other substance you add on top of that is a bonus. A great villain could be as simple as a big shark or even just a tornado. It's really not all that complex when you put it in simple terms. So with that in mind, it becomes all the more aggravating when Marvel botches it again and again. Example, the T-1000 is an emotionless, unrelatable void of a character whose only goal is to kill the protagonist. He barely emotes, he barely speaks, and he doesn't do anything outside of his pursuit to kill. Yet in spite of his simplicity, he is still an iconic and celebrated villain due to how creatively and effectively he pursues his goal. The way he's portrayed in the film makes him seem like an unstoppable menace, and it seems impossible to fathom how he could be killed. The only way the good guys could find safety is by moving far away from him and hiding. This is also in spite of the fact that they have their own Terminator to rely on. It's made very clear that he is better than them in every way, and it seems that if they even make one wrong move, he'll quickly take them out. And after a full movie of his deadly chase, it becomes highly rewarding to see the moment when the heroes finally find a way to come out on top. Sometimes you don't have to overthink it. If the story demands a simple killer to be great, then greatness is what you'll get if he plays his role well. Now if you compare the T-1000 to someone like Malekith, they are similar in that Malekith is also an empty void with no personality or nuance. But the reason why this one works while this one does not is because Malekith sucks at being a villain. Anytime he and Thor are in the same vicinity, Thor just pounds his face in. He does kill Thor's mother, but only after she slaps him around a bunch to the point where Kurse needs to step in and bail him out. So aside from that kill, he just spends the whole movie getting his emotionless face hammered in. See the difference? Now let's take a look at another villain that worked. Arguably the most iconic villain to hit the big screen, Darth Vader.
There is no escape. Don't make me destroy you.
He's massive, he has this dark, intimidating costume, and a booming voice. Whenever he's in the room, his presence is felt, and aside from the trench run, he largely dominates the heroes throughout all three films until the very end. If anyone ever needs good inspiration for an antagonist, this guy is a near-perfect example, and I do believe the MCU creators actually did follow his template, only in the worst way possible. It seems that most directors within the MCU each wanted to make their own Darth Vader, forcing their villain to be big, dark, and scary, even if they weren't like that in the books. That's a fine thing to do with one character, but when it happens again and again and again, it very quickly becomes a boring trope that I now refer to as the big gray blob. Not everyone gets to be Darth Vader. Sometimes you need a Jabba the Hutt, or a Boba Fett. Different enemies to fill different roles that make the world seem larger and make a more complete story. Marvel comics are packed full of many colorful and wildly distinct villains by intelligent design. It's incredibly easy to not only tell these villains apart here, but you can also learn a lot about their powers and personality just by looking at them. Character design is an extremely important element to the creative process of comics. So so it is criminal to see so many great villains get their unique and iconic designs butchered by people who fail to understand who these characters are, and were too short-sighted to think that maybe these guys shouldn't all look the same. And if you're going to make the costume dark, just be sure to not make it messy at the same time. Darth Vader, Voldemort, and so many other great villains do have dark costumes, but they also have simple designs that are easy to follow and remember. Too many of these modern villains suffer from being over-designed to the point where it's difficult to tell what you're looking at, and the lasting impression that they give you, if any at all, is just an image of nonsensical sludge. What's worse is that Darth Vader was great because he got results. And by getting results, I mean having a serious impact on the story. That can be defined as making a significant change in the hero's life, killing off other important characters, or being able to succeed in achieving their villainous goals. This leads to a side discussion about fairness in terms of victories and defeats in these stories, because even if a villain does succeed and gets some kind of win, it won't feel earned or narratively appropriate if the win is contrived or if the heroes are written out of character in order to fail. The inverse is also true and tends to be more common, which is a huge reason as to why so many people hate modern heroes. Too often these newbies lack the power or experience they should need in order to win, yet they just do it anyway. It doesn't feel earned, and it's not satisfying in the slightest. As audiences, we expect the good guy to win in the end at some point, but you can't just say it happens. You need to explain why in a manner that is either clever or triumphant. She-Hulk didn't have to earn anything in her story. She just complained to the manager to get what she wanted. Captain Marvel became super powerful and had this huge victory over the Kree, but it was not compelling in the slightest because her powers pretty much just came in arbitrarily when the writers decided it was her time to win. Spider-Man was able to defeat Doctor Strange, not because he was smarter or more powerful, but because the camera cut in close so you couldn't see what was happening. Then Strange sat there and did nothing as the writers cheated to make him lose. Conversely, as good as Infinity War was, Thanos did not earn his win over the Hulk, and this fight was the least satisfying in the franchise. Hulk was given no reason as to why he fought so pathetically, and the other Avengers were shown to be able to face Thanos in a much more competent way. On top of that, the Hulk was given no redemption afterwards. So this scene just comes off as the writers not liking the Hulk and wanting to get rid of him. In Iron Man 3, nerdy fake Mandarin here is able to cut through Iron Man's armor like butter, despite previous films showing that his armor is extremely durable. Based on what we've seen, it doesn't feel like he should be able to burn through these suits so easily, and as a result, Killian doesn't come off as powerful. Tony Stark just comes off as incompetent for making his new suits far inferior to his old ones. In stories like these, packed full of powerful tools and abilities, great care needs to be taken in order to maintain consistency and believability, because otherwise it will quickly become apparent that the writers aren't putting much thought into their stories, and audiences will quickly become bored and checked out. A villain who is easily defeated by an undeserving hero is hardly worth remembering. So to tie this back to Darth Vader, Empire Strikes Back was basically just 2 hours of him beating down the heroes left and right. He was established early on as a powerful being and consistently remained that way right up until the very end, while the story carefully crafted a satisfying explanation for his downfall. Even though you know the heroes will probably win in the end, it seemed like a great mystery as to how they would accomplish this task, because defeating this guy seemed impossible. The opposite is true for most MCU films. With the overabundance of tasteless, tone-deafening jokes, the danger usually always feels very low. If the heroes aren't taking this stuff seriously, why should the audience? Obviously this is very problematic, because how is a villain meant to make an impression when it feels like the heroes are never really in any danger? Let Tony Stark make his jokes, and let him use his charm, but when it's time to get serious, let him get serious. That's how he was in Iron Man 1, and that's part of what makes this film so much better than all the others. On top of the bad humor, the MCU villains could hardly ever seem to get anything done, with very little exception. We know that sequels will inevitably come. Take advantage of that, and let the villains win once in a while. Let's see what would happen if the Mandarin came out on top at the end of Iron Man 3. Let Loki force his way into ruling Asgard, and just let him be in control for a while. Don't just undo it right away. Let Ultron take over the world. Sure, the heroes will win in the end eventually, but it would be much more satisfying if the villains had their own series of wins first, and let the conflict last, instead of it always getting instantly resolved. Now don't get me wrong here, endings are also essential, and a lot of modern stories suffer from a lack of ending. All I'm saying is to not rush the process. Instead of making the Red Skull a one-and-done threat, make him the main antagonist of the Captain America trilogy. You can still have other villains show up with unique stories, but just allow this guy to better connect those splitting branches. Have the Red Skull return as Alexander Pierce in disguise. Connect Baron Zemo's origins back to Hydra, and show that either his father or his grandfather served with the Red Skull during World War II. Stuff like that to make the Red Skull seem like he has a larger presence within this world. The Green Goblin killed Aunt May, and then he just literally evaporated into another universe. No, piss off with the multiverse. Make a proper in-universe Green Goblin, let him kill Aunt May, then let him go on to have a long and devastating rivalry with Spider-Man. To paint more of a picture of what I'm talking about here, here's an example of what the MCU could look like if they implemented the changes I was talking about. The biggest change right out the gate is that I would want to remove Thanos. Now don't get get me wrong, Thanos could definitely show up eventually, but I think it would be better to have our first major antagonist be a group that could more effectively take advantage of the MCU structure, that being the Masters of Evil. Thanos was great, but his build-up was mostly just a series of cameos that didn't really do anything aside from reminding us that he existed. I've talked about the Masters of Evil many times in this series already, but just as a refresher, they're basically the evil Avengers. Having a group instead of one single villain would give them the ability to have just as fun of a build-up as the Avengers themselves. You can still have these one-off films like The Incredible Hulk and Iron Man, but as we watch the hero roster grow, so does the villain roster. Establish Baron Zemo early on as an evil Nick Fury of sorts, paying attention to the various battles of the world and recruiting these various villains to his side, and let us take the time to get to know these people and get invested in their stories. Then instead of having the Avengers battle this big gray CGI wall of nothing, make the big final battle be essentially all the heroes versus all the villains. Make the entire event one big payoff that rewards dedicated viewers who invested their time watching each and every solo film leading up to this point. This big change would also be helpful for post-Endgame stories as well, because once Thanos died, audiences knew that most of the stakes and drama died with him, so there was no longer a desire to continue watching. However, if you had multiple big-name villains in the big finale, then while some may get killed off, you can allow others to live on and fight another day, and thereby help maintain audience investment going forward. Conversely, if the mandate is that we need to use Thanos, then each film that precedes him should either directly tie back to him in some way, such as Ronin, or they should have a heavy impact on the hero's evolution, such as the Winter Soldier. Dormammu has little to no impact on the story aside from helping Doctor Strange show off the Time Stone's power, so how about we save him for later and replace him with Mephisto, who is basically Marvel's devil for those who don't know, and is also someone who played a big role in the Infinity Gauntlet comic. Hype Mephisto up in a similar way that you did with Dormammu, but then bring him back later on and establish him as an underling of Thanos, to help show off how big of a threat Thanos is, and to have Mephisto around as a villain to defeat in Endgame. Give the villains of the other solo films a similar treatment, and use them to steadily bolster Thanos' entourage. Take out villains like Ultron and Baron Zemo and save them for later. In the meantime, use characters that will be more directly relevant to the Infinity Saga, then you could take advantage of this carefully crafted entourage, and have all these various showdowns play out while the Avengers are trying to go through their time heist in Endgame. That would probably be a bit more exciting than what we got, which was just watching the Avengers sit around and talk about butts all day. Maintain Loki as an ally of Thanos, and to make his inevitable betrayal an act that comes with selfish reasons. Then have Loki live on as a villain, so audiences can have something to look forward to after Endgame. And speaking of post-Endgame, this is the time to really take advantage of your heavy hitters, to recapture people's excitement. Kang is a decent enough villain, but his story is a bit messy to say the least, and frankly he's not the most popular guy out there. Instead, why aren't we hyping up bigger names like Doctor Doom, Galactus, Dormammu, or even a second attempt at Ultron? It's no wonder why people are losing interest in mass, because Kamala Khan and She-Hulk were given priority over the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. And all we get from our next big bad is seeing him work a desk job, watching him get beat up by ants, and getting the promise of more unappealing, messy, cheap multiverse adventures that are guaranteed to lower the stakes and further butcher everybody's investment in the long-term story in favor of gimmicks that will rapidly cheapen the more they rely on them. Now, hindsight is 20/20, and it's easy for me to sit here and say what should have been because I didn't have to pioneer this massive undertaking in the first place. Making this massive interconnected cinematic colossus of a franchise is an impressive feat. So if they make a few mistakes along the way, that's definitely understandable. That said, these problems have persisted for well over a decade now and have only ever gotten worse with time. That is inexcusable. Marvel, do you want your fans to like your new crappy characters? A guaranteed way to pull that off would be to put them up against the deadliest, most ruthless, most unstoppable villains imaginable. If you make your heroes suffer at the hands of a powerful villain, and to make their journey towards victory seem extremely difficult, then fans will naturally rally to their side when empathy kicks in. It's really not that complex. But no, instead you'll either be too insecure and desperate to prove that your hero is cool, so you'll make everything easy and fun for them, or you'll be too eager to make your villain misunderstood and relatable, to the point where you will forget to make them do anything bad, and the heroes will randomly like them when they have no reason to think that way. The villain problem goes beyond Marvel as well, as many modern films, shows, games, and otherwise suffer from boring, gentle, sad, gray, and unimpactful villains. We need to go back to the days of the ruthless villains, who were smarter, deadlier, more successful, and more revered. The MCU in particular is specifically getting called out in this video series because it comes from a legacy that should have allowed it to pioneer a new era of classic cinematic villains year after year, and that's not even counting the great powerhouses like Magneto, Galactus, and Doctor Doom, who they didn't have access to yet. The Mandarin, Baron Zemo, MODOK, Ultron, the Leader, Arnim Zola, Malekith, the Enchantress, Claw, Ego, and all the rest should easily have the ability to stand shoulder to shoulder with all the greats that came before, and this video series was made to essentially serve as a memoriam to what could have been. Phew, that video took a while to make. Let's see what's been going on in the world while I was away.
Oh my goodness!